June 4, 1943. Railroad Street, Mexia, Texas. The pencil shook in Unifitzia Vera Burkhart's hand as he wrote secretly in his diary. If his officers found it, he'd be thrown into solitary. The Americans must be lying. No country could have this much while fighting on two fronts. He had just looked out the train window and seen something that shattered 3 years of Nazi propaganda. Electric lights burned from every house, every shop, every street corner. A sea of lights stretched across the Texas plains at 10 p.m. In Germany, blackouts had covered the Reich in darkness since 1940. Even before the war, only 1 in 5 German farms had power. But here, in the America their leaders had called decadent and collapsing, electricity flowed everywhere, as common as water. 1,850 veterans of Rommel's Africa Corps stepped down from the train. Not from cattle cars, not from freight wagons, but from cushioned Pullman coaches with dining cars and sleeping berths. The whole town of Mahia had gathered to watch. None of them realized this moment would spark one of the greatest psychological shifts in modern history. The slow destruction of Nazi ideology, not by speeches or battles, but by the raw proof of American industrial strength. The future of Allied victory was being written, not in battle maps, but in production numbers that would soon crush everything these soldiers believed about their homeland, their cause, and their enemies. That collapse had begun weeks earlier, on May 13, 1943, in Tunisia. General Jürgen von Arnim, Rommel's replacement, surrendered with 250,000 to 275,000 German and Italian soldiers. The Wehrmacht's finest desert fighters, men who had once driven the British to Egypt and earned even Montgomery's respect, were suddenly prisoners. Among them was Headman Friedrich Radke, Iron Cross First Class, a veteran of France, wounded twice in North Africa. His diary, found decades later in the National Archives, gave historians the clearest view of how captivity in America broke German beliefs. Their journey from defeat to revelation started in Oran, Algeria. Radke and 30,000 others waited in makeshift camps for ships. Even there, American efficiency was cracking their illusions. Thousands of POWs were processed daily with more order than the Wehrmacht ever showed at its peak. Photos taken, identity cards filed, medical exams done, vaccines given, and rights under the Geneva Convention explained in flawless German, by American officers trained just for this. But the first real shock came with the food. Hans Mahler of the 21st Panzer Division later wrote to his mother, in Oran, waiting for ships, the Americans fed us better than we had eaten in 6 months of desert fighting. White bread, real coffee, meat twice a day. We thought it was propaganda. We didn't know this was their normal ration, Then came the Liberty ships. The very vessels carrying them across the Atlantic were proof of American might. The SS Robert E. Peary had been built in just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes at Kaiser shipyards in California. If the Germans had heard that, they would have laughed it off as impossible propaganda. But it was true. At the height of the war, America was building 3 of these massive ships every single day. Steel proof that their industrial power was unstoppable. Instead of returning empty after delivering supplies to Europe, Liberty ships carried human cargo. Up to 30,000 German POWs every month by the summer of 1943. The 2-week Atlantic crossing in July 1943 marked the second stage of their psychological breakdown. Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann of the 90th Light Division wrote letters to his family that later survived. He described how the ship's crew threw away more food in a single day than his entire company had eaten in a week during their last months in Africa. Half-eaten steaks, whole loaves of bread, even gallons of milk left out too long, all tossed aside without thought. Not as mockery, but because to the Americans, supplies seemed endless. The ships themselves became classrooms in American power. The prisoners learned that the vessel carrying them was just one of 2,710 Liberty ships built during the war. Each ship needed 250,000 parts produced across 32 states. The massive engines, they overheard from chatty guards, were assembled from cylinders made in 3 separate factories, each one producing 900 horsepower units, then put together in ports that hadn't even existed 2 years before. Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm von Stobern, from an old Prussian family that had fought in every German war since Frederick the Great, later wrote in his memoirs, "As our ship neared the American coast, I saw the radar antenna turning above the bridge. This technology, which we thought only we and perhaps the British had in small numbers, was standard equipment on an American cargo ship. It was then I first suspected Germany had already lost the war. Asterisk. On August 2nd, 1943, they reached Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia. The sight of America crushed the last illusions Nazi propaganda had drilled into them. The base stretched over 4,300 acres. Docks ran for miles. Cranes loaded and unloaded dozens of ships at once. In a single day, this one port moved more cargo than Hamburg, Germany's largest port, could manage in a week. Gerhard Johann Weber, once a factory worker in the Ruhr, counted 47 cargo ships being loaded or unloaded. Each crane lifted loads that would have taken a dozen men and horses back home. Here, machines powered by electricity worked smoothly, endlessly, without the choking smoke that filled German cities. Formed into columns, the prisoners marched toward waiting trains. On the way, they passed parking lots filled with cars, hundreds of them owned by ordinary dock workers. In Germany, private cars were reserved for the wealthy or the Nazi elite. The Volkswagen, promised to the people since 1934, was still just a dream, with fewer than 1,000 ever delivered. Yet here, in America, everyday workers drove their own cars to their jobs. And then came the trains. Not boxcars. Not the cramped 40 and 8 wagons that had carried German troops. 40 men or 8 horses, but full passenger coaches. Pullman cars with padded seats, built for comfort, waiting to take them deeper into a world that shattered every belief they had been raised on. The passenger cars had been converted into sleeping berths. Dining cars came with white tablecloths and silver cutlery. Observation cars had wide windows for sightseeing. Hedman Radke later wrote, asterisk, we boarded like tourists, not prisoners. Asterisk. The American guards almost seemed embarrassed by how comfortable it was. One sergeant even apologized that the air conditioning wasn't working properly. Air conditioning. In August 1943, most of them believed such luxury existed only on Hitler's personal train. The 3-day train ride from Norfolk to prison camps in Texas and Oklahoma would do more to destroy Nazi ideology than any battlefield defeat. As the trains rolled through Virginia, the prisoners pressed their faces to the glass, staring at an America they had been told did not exist. Every small town glowed with light. Martinsville, Danville, Greensboro, places that in Germany might have had a single street lamp, were filled with glowing shop windows, neon signs, and houses lit up in several rooms at once. The trains passed factories working night shifts, their windows blazing, parking lots full even at midnight. Obergefreiter Meyer, whose father had been a Nazi party block leader in Hamburg, wrote years later, asterisk, we passed through dozens of cities that first night. Each one had more electricity than all of Hamburg. The guards told us this was normal, that every American town had power since the 1920s. I called him a liar. He just shrugged and said we would see. Asterisk. In Roanoke, Virginia, the train stopped for water and coal. The prisoners watched as American railway workers did in 30 minutes what would have taken 2 hours in Germany. Automated coal loaders, electric pumps, mechanized systems. Everything showed efficiency and technology far beyond what they knew. Even more unsettling was the casual wealth of the workers themselves. They wore leather boots that would have cost a German laborer 2 months' pay. They drank Coca-Cola from glass bottles, tossing them away without a thought. They smoked cigarettes non-stop, sometimes leaving them half-finished. Feldwebel Hinrichmuller, once an electrical engineer at Siemens, calculated that the single railway yard they stopped in used more electricity in 1 hour than his entire Berlin district used in a day. The waste was magnificent, he wrote. Asterisk, lights burned in empty buildings. Fans spun in vacant rooms. It was the carelessness of infinite resource. Asterisk, crossing into Tennessee and Kentucky, the prisoners saw American industry on a scale they had never imagined. Endless factories rolled past their windows. The Alcoa aluminum plant in Tennessee stretched 3 miles along a river, its furnaces consuming 175,000 kilowatts of electricity, more than the entire city of Munich. Near Louisville, the train slowed by the Rubbertown complex. In just 18 months, empty fields had become 4 massive synthetic rubber plants. Thousands of workers labored there, producing 800,000 tons of synthetic rubber every year. It was industrial power on a scale that left them stunned. Germany had invented the process, but even in its best year never produced more than 120,000 tons of synthetic rubber. Oberleutnant Erich Hoffmann, a chemist from IG Farben, grasped the meaning instantly. In a post-war interview, he said, "I knew those plants. I recognized the distillation columns, the catalytic crackers. Each one was more advanced than anything we had ever built, and there were 4 of them in just one place. They told us there were dozens more across the country." Then the trains passed Ford's Willow Run plant outside Detroit, a factory so big it could be seen from miles away. Built in only 9 months, it produced one B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. At peak output, 42,000 workers assembled the bombers from 1.5 million parts supplied by 1,500 subcontractors. The plant covered 2.5 million square feet and consumed more electricity than the entire German city of Cologne. Hauptmann Verli, a Luftwaffe pilot shot down in Tunisia, pressed his face to the window as they passed. He counted 17 B-24 bombers in different stages of assembly. We had been told American planes were inferior, rushed, and would fall apart in combat. But I could see the precision of the assembly lines, the quality of the workmanship. These were not inferior aircraft. They were simply built faster than we thought possible. The deeper the trains rolled into America, the more Nazi myths collapsed. In St. Louis, they crossed the Mississippi on the Eads Bridge. Below them, barges carried more grain than all of Germany's 1942 harvest. On both banks, giant grain elevators lined the river, each one storing enough wheat to feed a German city for months. Unterscharführer Karl Schmidt, a farmer's son from Bavaria, wrote in his diary, "The Americans move food as we move ammunition, in endless quantities, without fear of shortage. I saw a single barge loaded with enough wheat to feed my village for 5 years. The crane operator ate a sandwich with more meat than our entire weekly ration." In Kansas City, the train stopped near a huge stockyard where tens of thousands of cattle stood waiting for slaughter. The smell of meatpacking plants filled the air for miles. German POWs, used to surviving on 200 grams of meat a week in Africa, watched American workers eat beef sandwiches on their breaks. "They ate meat like we ate bread," wrote Gefreiter Paul Fischer. No, that's wrong. They ate meat like we wished we could eat bread. At the station, a guard bought them hamburgers from a stand, meat, cheese, vegetables on soft white bread. He bought 20 at once, paid with a single dollar, and didn't think twice. It wasn't special. It was everyday food. And then came the camps. Camp Hearn, Texas, built in just 4 months, held 3,000 to 4,800 prisoners in conditions better than most had known as civilians. Wooden barracks with electric lights, flush toilets, hot showers, and steam heating. For many Germans, the final stage of disbelief had arrived. Each building in the camp used more lumber than whole German villages owned. The camp hospital shocked the German medical staff. Oberst, Lieutenant Colonel Dr. Friedrich Bauer, chief surgeon of the 164th Light Division, admitted the facility was better equipped than most German hospitals back home. There were X-ray machines, surgical tools, and medicine supplies that Germany hadn't seen since 1941. Even penicillin, this miracle drug the Germans had only heard whispers about, was available and used freely, even on prisoners with small infections. Meanwhile, German soldiers at the front were dying for lack of the most basic drugs. The kitchen told another story of American wealth. Prisoners working as cooks found giant walk-in refrigerators, electric mixers, dishwashers, and gas stoves that could prepare food for thousands. Their daily rations included fresh milk, eggs, meat, vegetables, and white bread, things German civilians hadn't seen since before the war. Feldwebel Otto Krebs, once a hotel chef in Munich, wrote, "Today we threw away more food than my family has seen in 3 years. Not spoiled food, just extra. The Americans make us prepare 10% more to be sure everyone eats well. The rest goes in the garbage. I cried as I tossed away perfectly good bread." By September 1943, with farm labor short, the U.S. began sending prisoners to work in fields and factories. This choice, born of necessity, destroyed Nazi myths more powerfully than propaganda ever could. The prisoners weren't blindfolded. They saw everything: the endless corn and wheat fields, factories working day and night, stores full of goods, parking lots packed with cars, and houses with refrigerators and radios. At a cotton gin outside Houston, Untersatz Herbert Lang watched a single machine process more cotton in 1 hour than his whole village could handle in a month. It ran on electricity from the Colorado River Authority, which by then had brought power to 90% of Texas farms. The farmer who owned it wasn't rich or noble, just an ordinary man. Yet he had running water, cars, tractors, and his workers, black and white alike, ate lunches bigger than a German worker's weekly ration. And this wasn't special. It was normal. In Nebraska, prisoners worked sugar beet fields and saw machines that replaced entire armies of labor. One combine could do the work of 100 men. The fields stretched as far as the eye could see, bigger than whole German counties. Farmers casually talked about crop yields that Germans would call impossible. 60 bushels of wheat per acre compared to Germany's 30 on its best land. Gefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann, sent to work on a farm outside Scottsbluff, wrote, *The farmer's son, just 16 years old, drove a tractor worth more than everything my father earned in his whole life. When I said so, the boy laughed. He told me it wasn't even a good tractor. His father was waiting for the new model. *The farmer's son had joked about waiting for a new John Deere tractor, one even better than the one he already had. But the most crushing realizations came to prisoners who worked in or near American factories. The Geneva Convention banned them from making weapons directly, but they were allowed to work in industries that freed American workers for military production. That loophole gave thousands of Germans a front-row seat to American industrial power. At a Campbell's soup factory in New Jersey, prisoners watched tomatoes being processed in one day, more than most German plants could manage in a month. The factory wasn't even fully staffed, just women and elderly men, since most of the younger workers were off fighting. Yet production was higher than before the war. Stabsfeldwebel Ernst Wagner, who had worked in food processing back home, described the shock. Everything was automated, electric conveyor belts, machines that filled cans on their own, steam cookers that handled hundreds at once. One older woman managed controls that in Germany would have needed 50 workers. She did it while sipping coffee and listening to the radio. Near Detroit, prisoners unloading coal at a power plant got glimpses of the legendary River Rouge complex across the water. It employed 100,000 people making jeeps, aircraft engines, and tanks. The plant devoured 1.5 million kilowatts of electricity each day, more than the entire city of Hamburg. Oberstfreiter Franz Kellner remembered staring at the vast parking lots filled with workers' cars. In Germany, even officers rarely owned cars, but here factory workers not only drove to work, some owned two, one for commuting, another for family. At first, the Germans thought the guard was mocking them. He wasn't. By the winter of 1943, all of this, factories, farms, food, machines, was eroding the German worldview. American intelligence officers even had a name for it: ideological collapse syndrome. Prisoners, once defiant, began asking for American books, newspapers, and classes. Major Paul Newland, who monitored them, wrote in December 1943, "They no longer argue when shown production statistics. They have seen too much. Even the most fanatical Nazis are quiet. They still claim loyalty to Germany, but no longer speak of victory." The change even showed up in camp newspapers written by the prisoners. At Fort Kearny, Rhode Island, the paper Der Ruff shifted from shouting nationalism to talking about democracy, economics, and rebuilding after the war. Anti-Nazi editors, chosen carefully, found more and more readers open to the message. Lieutenant Hermann Gutz of the 10th Panzer Division wrote in a censored letter, "We were told America was weak, divided, a mongrel nation controlled by Jews, incapable of real strength. Every day here proves the opposite. This is the most organized, united, and powerful nation on earth. We were told fairy tales by criminals." But perhaps the hardest blow to Nazi beliefs came from something unexpected. The way America treated Italian prisoners after Italy surrendered in September 1943, that Italian POWs who chose to cooperate were placed into special Italian service units. They received better housing, higher pay, and more freedom. German prisoners watched with disbelief as their former allies worked freely beside Americans, ate in restaurants, and even dated American women. Feldwebel Friedrich Schultz wrote, "The Italians betrayed us, yet they are treated better than we treated them as allies. They earn money, send packages home. The Americans show them no hatred. This democracy we were told to despise seems more honorable than our own system." Christmas 1943 hit the Germans harder than any lecture or speech. American churches, civic groups, and charities sent out 500,000 Christmas packages, gifts for men who had been trying to kill their sons and brothers months earlier. Each box carried cigarettes, candy, games, and toiletries. Communities invited prisoners to Christmas dinners, though most weren't allowed to attend. At Camp Hearn in Texas, the local Methodist choir sang carols in German. Women baked cookies and cakes. Boy Scouts delivered handmade cards. This kindness toward enemies destroyed the last remnants of Nazi racial propaganda. Oberleutnant Walter Müller, whose own brother had died in Hamburg under Allied bombs, wrote, "They know we are their enemies. Many have sons fighting us. Yet they show Christian charity, real kindness, not propaganda." What kind of people treat their enemies this way? Only those completely certain of victory and secure in their power. The Christmas feast itself was staggering. Turkey, ham, potatoes, gravy, vegetables, pies, ice cream, mountains of food. Germany hadn't seen such plenty since before the First World War. Prisoners ate until they were sick, stunned that such abundance was being spent on them. Feldwebel Hansa wrote, "We ate like kings. Better than generals, better than party leaders." And this was not special. The guards told us every American family ate this way at Christmas. If they feed us like this, what must their soldiers eat? By early 1944, more than 40,000 prisoners were enrolled in American education programs. They studied English, history, math, and science. The University of Chicago ran correspondence courses. Stanford even sent professors to teach democracy and economics. The hunger for knowledge was endless. Men who had believed Americans were uncultured barbarians discovered libraries with millions of books, universities open to all classes, and scientific research that led the world. They read newspapers with multiple viewpoints, something unthinkable in Nazi Germany. Dr. Wilhelm von Braun, a physicist from the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, attended lectures on atomic physics at Camp Shelby. He later wrote, "American professors, including Jewish refugees from Germany, taught us without hatred. They treated science as universal, belonging to all humanity. They were years ahead of us, and they shared knowledge even with their enemies. Such generosity was impossible for us to understand under Nazi ideology." The camp theaters showed not propaganda, but real Hollywood films. Prisoners watched Gone with the Wind, a story of defeat and recovery that mirrored their own situation. They saw The Grapes of Wrath and marveled that Americans would show such brutal honesty about poverty and struggle, even to their enemies. Lieutenant Joseph Kramer wrote, "They hide nothing. They show their problems, their failures, their conflicts. Yet this honesty makes them stronger, not weaker." In Germany, such criticism would mean death. Here it is called patriotism. By spring 1944, prisoner labor expanded again as American industry reached its peak. German POWs were placed in canneries, mills, and factories, witnessing firsthand a scale of production no Nazi speech could dismiss. At the Higgins Boat Factory in New Orleans, they unloaded steel that became landing craft for D-Day. They saw 700 boats built every month, each requiring 20,000 parts. The factory employed 20,000 workers, including women welding hulls, black workers operating machines, and teenagers drilling parts. Stabsfeldwebel Kurt Zimmermann wrote, "Women doing men's work, Negroes on machinery, teenagers running drills. Everything we were told was impossible in a democracy. Yet production never stopped. 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They built more boats in 1 month than our Navy did in a year." Women ran cranes, black workers operated heavy machinery, teenagers handled drills, and the assembly lines never stopped. Stabsfeldwebel Kurt Zimmermann wrote, "Everything we were told was impossible in a democracy was happening before our eyes. Yet production never stopped, 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They built more boats in 1 month than our entire Navy produced in a year." At Republic Steel in Ohio, prisoners saw 10,000 tons of steel poured daily. Endless trains brought iron ore from Minnesota and coal from Pennsylvania to feed blast furnaces that never cooled. The scale was beyond anything Germans could imagine. One plant alone produced more steel than the entire Ruhr at its peak. Oberstfreiter Paul Hartmann, who had worked in industry before the war, confessed, "I thought I knew industrial production, but this was beyond imagination. They wasted more steel and spillage than we could produce. Their workers complained about overtime while producing quantities we couldn't match with slave labor and double shifts." Then came the summer harvest of 1944, which destroyed the last illusions about American weakness. Across the Midwest, German prisoners saw agricultural power on a world-shaking scale. In Kansas, single farms produced more grain than entire German provinces. Combines swept across fields like ships on a golden ocean, each harvesting 100 acres a day. The grain elevators could hold more wheat than Germany imported in a year. Unteroffizier Franz Weber, a farmer from East Prussia, wrote, "One American farmer with his machines does the work of 100 German farmers. They showed me aerial photos of their wheat fields, thousands of square miles of grain. They could lose half their harvest and still feed more than all of Europe." In California's Central Valley, prisoners picked fruit in orchards that stretched beyond the horizon. They watched in horror as flawless food was discarded over tiny blemishes, fruit that would have been priceless in starving Germany. Sometimes whole crops were plowed under to stabilize prices. Gefreiter Otto Schultz wrote, "They destroyed food to keep prices steady. Mountains of oranges bulldozed into pits because there were too many. We begged to send them to our families, but the guards said it was impossible. This waste was proof of resources without limit." And then came June 6, 1944. When news of the Normandy invasion reached the camps, any last fragments of belief in Nazi propaganda collapsed. The sheer scale, 6,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, 150,000 men in the first wave, was beyond Germany's wildest imagination. It was the ultimate proof of American power and the final blow to the myths they had been raised on. At Camp Shelby, German prisoners watched newsreels of the Normandy invasion only days after it began. They saw endless lines of ships, artificial harbors rising from the sea, and a supply system that moved 15,000 tons a day across open beaches. They watched their homeland being crushed by the very nation they had been told was too weak to fight. Friedrich von Eben wrote, "We knew then that everything was lost, not just the war, but the entire Nazi project. We had challenged the world's greatest industrial power with fairy tales and racial mythology. We sent horses against their trucks, rifles against their automatic weapons, courage against their endless resources." But throughout captivity, the prisoners encountered something even more shocking than American wealth, American humanity. Despite years of propaganda painting Americans as soft and sentimental, the prisoners discovered a people confident enough in their strength to show mercy. When Gefreiter Hans Muller's son was killed in the Hamburg bombing, the camp commander personally delivered the Red Cross message and offered his condolences. When Lieutenant Paul Fischer's wife wrote that she was struggling to feed their children, American church groups sent food packages to her in Germany, aid to enemy civilians in a country still under attack. Oberfeldwebel Otto Hedman recalled, "They separated the German people from the Nazi regime. They said they were fighting Hitler, not Germans. What we thought was propaganda turned out to be true. They were preparing us to rebuild Germany, not to destroy it." Medical treatment left an especially deep impression. German doctors worked alongside American medical staff, learning new techniques and using advanced equipment. Prisoners received surgeries that in Germany would have been reserved only for the elite. Mental health care, almost unknown in the Wehrmacht, was given to traumatized soldiers. Dr. Friedrich Bauer remembered, "They treated suicide attempts with counseling, not punishment. Soldiers with mental breakdowns were given therapy, not beatings." This humanity toward enemies revealed a kind of strength we had never understood, the confidence of true power. By March 1945, a secret re-education program was in full swing, and its results stunned even the Americans. More than 25,000 prisoners had volunteered for democracy courses. Camp newspapers carried articles on constitutional government, free markets, and civil rights. Discussion groups debated Germany's future after the war. The change was astonishing. Fanatical Nazis were now writing essays on democratic reconstruction. Officers who once swore oaths to Hitler were planning how to bring American farming techniques back to Germany. In a 1975 interview, Oberst Hermann Göring, no relation to the Reichsmarschall, admitted, "We became missionaries for democracy. Not because of coercion or propaganda, but because we saw it work. We saw ordinary people in America living better than German aristocracy. We wanted that for Germany." The transformation was so complete that some American officials began to worry the prisoners were becoming too enthusiastic. Many asked to stay in the United States after the war. Some even married and built new lives there. Some German prisoners even fell in love with American women they met through prison correspondence programs. Thousands of them later immigrated to the United States during the 1950s. Then came April 1945, the final, crushing revelation. As American forces liberated concentration camps in Germany, the footage was shown to the prisoners. At first, many refused to believe it, dismissing it as propaganda. But the evidence was undeniable. Photographs, newsreels, testimony from American soldiers, and eventually letters from their own families in Germany confirming the horror. The impact was shattering. Men who had clung to some pride in German honor, even in defeat, now faced the total moral collapse of their nation. Everything they had fought for was not just lost, it was evil. Headman Walter Schmidt wrote, "We thought we were warriors for a great cause. We discovered we were tools of criminals. We believed we were bringing civilization to inferior peoples. We found out that we were the barbarians. The Americans we called weak and decadent showed us what civilization really meant." When the war ended in May 1945, German prisoners of war faced repatriation with heavy, conflicted emotions. They had lived in an America that contradicted everything they had been taught. They had eaten better as prisoners than as soldiers. They had been treated with more dignity by their enemies than by their own government. In their final months of captivity, American authorities prepared them for life after the war. They received vocational training, agricultural education, and political instruction. Many even learned about the Marshall Plan before it was publicly announced, realizing that America intended not to destroy Germany, but to rebuild it. Oberst Friedrich von Tauben wrote, "They prepared us to rebuild our country. They gave us skills, knowledge, hope. They transformed defeated soldiers into future citizens." This generosity was almost impossible to comprehend for men shaped by years of Nazi cruelty and revenge. Yet between 1945 and 1946, 371,683 German prisoners were repatriated from American camps. They returned to a homeland divided, destroyed, and starving, but they brought with them something powerful: first-hand knowledge of how a democratic, industrial society worked. These former prisoners became unexpected agents of transformation. They had seen American factories, farms, and communities thrive under freedom, not tyranny. Many went on to play key roles in rebuilding West Germany. Hans Kroll, once a prisoner at Camp Shelby, became West German ambassador to the United States. Walter Hallstein, who taught classes in captivity, became president of the European Commission. Rüdiger von Marx, held at Camp Herne, later served as Germany's permanent representative to the United Nations. Eduard Ackermann, a prisoner at Fort Robinson, led agricultural reforms that reshaped German farming. They brought American methods to German industry, American efficiency to German agriculture, and American democratic ideals to German politics. The economic miracle of the 1950s was built in part on knowledge learned in those American prison camps. Hans Kroll later wrote in his memoirs, "We learned that prosperity came from freedom, not conquest. We saw that democracy created wealth, that diversity brought strength, that treating workers well increased production." Historians now call the German prisoner experience in America one of the most successful re-education programs in history. It worked not through forced propaganda, but through simple observation. The prisoners saw America with their own eyes, its strength, its freedom, its humanity. They ate American food, read American newspapers, studied in American classrooms, and watched American families live better than Germany's rulers. In the end, it was this direct experience that broke the spell of Nazi ideology and helped lay the foundation for a new Germany. Arnold Kramer, the leading historian of German prisoners in America, summed it up simply. America didn't win the propaganda war with words, but with reality. Every hot meal, every electric light, every working toilet was proof that Nazism was a lie. The prisoners were converted by prosperity. The numbers back him up. Out of 371,683 German prisoners held in the United States, fewer than 1% ever tried to escape. Just 2,222 attempts total. Postwar surveys revealed that 95% of them rated their treatment as good or excellent. Even more remarkable, thousands kept in touch with American families for decades after the war. In 1985, on the 40th anniversary of the war's end, over 500 former prisoners returned to Austin, Texas, many bringing their children and grandchildren to see where their transformation had begun. Hans Vea, once held at Fort Robinson and later a physician in Maine, told the gathering, "For many of us, life in the camps was better than what we'd known growing up in Germany. We discovered running water, central heating, and enough food. But more importantly, we discovered dignity." Kurt Meir, who had worked on farms in Iowa, added, "The farmers didn't treat us like enemies, but like young men far from home. They shared meals, knowledge, even their homes. This kindness, from people whose sons were fighting against us, changed us forever." The keynote speaker, 78-year-old Herman Gutz, captured the heart of the experience. "We came to America as enemies, as Nazis, as believers in a lie. We left as friends, as Democrats, as men who had seen the truth. America showed us that real strength comes not from conquest, but from production. Not from hatred, but from diversity. Not from tyranny, but from freedom. We saw farmers who fed the world, workers who built victory, and citizens who treated even enemies with dignity. America's true weapon was not its bombs or tanks, but its endless capacity to create and its unshakable confidence. We returned determined to build a Germany that could prosper in peace instead of war. We who came as conquerors left as students. To America, from your former enemies, now your friends, we thank you for showing us the way." The auditorium erupted in a standing ovation. Americans and Germans, once mortal enemies, stood together as proof of a transformation no one could have imagined back in June 1943, when the first trains of prisoners rolled into Texas. The scale of the German prisoner experience in America was massive, and the results were extraordinary. Camps more than 500 across 45 states, all but Nevada, North Dakota, and Vermont, including 175 main camps and 325 smaller branches. Built in an average of just 90 days, some housed as few as 250 men, others up to 12,000. Prisoner population 371,683 Germans out of 425,871 Axis prisoners total. Peak population came in May 1945, with up to 60,000 new arrivals per month after D-Day. Labor contribution 14 million days of agricultural work, 100 million board feet of lumber processed, and $230 million worth of labor in 1940s wages. Just 80 cents a day per prisoner. They helped fill labor shortages in 46 states. Escapes only 2,222 attempts, 0.6%, with 0 permanent successes. Nearly all escapees were caught within 24 hours, and not a single American civilian was harmed. Education over 40,000 prisoners enrolled in courses, 135 camp newspapers were published, 30,000 studied English, and 15,000 received vocational training. Universities even offered correspondence programs. By the end of the war, what had begun as captivity turned into one of the most remarkable re-education efforts in history. Not through force, but through example. Not through propaganda, but through reality. After the war, the story of German prisoners in America did not simply end with their release. Around 5,000 former prisoners immigrated permanently to the United States. More than 12,000 kept up correspondence with American families they had met, often writing back and forth for decades, the average friendship lasting 31 years. Many later returned as tourists, some as business partners, always drawn back to the place where their transformation had begun. When asked about their time in captivity, the verdict was overwhelming. 95% rated their treatment as good or excellent. Nearly 3/4 said it had changed their worldview for the better. 61% said they wanted to learn more about democracy. By 1945, fewer than 1 in 10 still held tightly to Nazi beliefs. For these men, captivity had become something far greater than imprisonment. It was education. It was enlightenment. And in a deeper sense, it was liberation, not from fences and barbed wire, but from the chains of Nazi ideology. America's greatest victory, in the end, was not won on the battlefield, but inside the prison camps, where the daily reality of democratic prosperity shattered illusions and conquered enemy minds. The men who had stepped off trains in 1943 were proud warriors of the Third Reich. The men who boarded ships back to Germany in 1946 were different. They carried back with them the seeds of democracy. They had seen the future, and they knew it worked. What transformed them was not propaganda, but proof. Every factory line running day and night, every farm producing food on a scale beyond imagination, every classroom and library open to them, every act of kindness shown even to enemies. Together these became arguments no Nazi lie could overcome. America's most powerful weapon was not its tanks or planes, but its ability to create abundance and its confidence to share it. The transformation of these prisoners helped lay the foundation for Europe's rebirth. The economic miracle that rebuilt West Germany in the 1950s rested partly on lessons first learned in those American camps. That prosperity comes from freedom, not conquest, from dignity, not racial superiority, from cooperation, not tyranny. The German soldiers had expected to find a weak, divided America. Instead, they discovered an industrial giant fueled by democracy and humanity. They came as prisoners of war, but left as witnesses to the arsenal of democracy at its strongest. Their awe at America's abundance planted the psychological seeds of the Marshall Plan, the Atlantic Alliance, and the democratic reconstruction of Germany. Their children would grow up in a free Germany, allied with the United States. And it all began when a train carrying 1,850 Afrika Korps veterans rolled into Mexia, Texas, and the men inside discovered that everything they had believed was wrong. The story of the German prisoners in America is ultimately a story of redemption through revelation. It shows that the greatest victories are sometimes won not by destruction, but by demonstration, not by propaganda, but by prosperity, not by hatred, but by humanity. These former enemies became unwitting ambassadors of democracy, carrying back the lessons that would reshape their homeland. Their journey, from Nazi warriors to democratic citizens, remains one of the most remarkable transformations in modern history. And it was achieved not through force, but through the undeniable power of example. That was America's true secret weapon, not just the ability to build more bombs and tanks than any other nation, but the ability to turn enemies into friends. In that transformation lay the foundation of a better world.